Twitter. Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And in our special all queer liberation episode, we are rejoined by Laura Miles, who was a longtime education union activist and worker, and she's also the author of Transgender Resistance, Socialism, and the Fight for Trans Liberation. So yes, this is our all things, not just all things queer liberation, but since we're mostly going to be talking about the UK, it's also our all things England UK edition. And Laura, firstly, thank you so much for coming back on the program. It's a real honor to get the chance to talk to you again.
It's great to be back. It's good to talk to you again.
Likewise, and yes, and it's the month of Pride. I got all of my trying to be a good ally, got all of my Pride stuff on here, and yes, and so let's get started because we don't have too much time with you today, and that is just your thoughts in general on the general election that England is going through. And the last time we talked, we were talking a lot about the sort of new chapter in transphobia, heteronormativity that governments are engaging in. The ruling Conservative Party, which I thought, since the time of David Cameron, when they call themselves One Nation Tory, that usually means they're okay with black people joining the Conservative Party. They're okay with queer people, and queer people can get married. Even okay with trans people and that stuff. But what they are, of course, very, very regressive on is foreign policy and making sure that the plutocrats are taken well care of, and very cruel austerity and the shock doctrine and so forth. So in general, what's your opinion on what's going on with this general election, and has transphobia still been part of the multiple political parties and whatnot, and as a as a trans woman, are you, if you were to talk to your other to people within your community and people within the wider queer community, who would you even suggest that they vote for in this election? So go ahead.
Well, yes, the who to vote for is a real live issue. Because it's not clear, because unfortunately the main opposition party, the Labour Party, has equivocated on so many issues. Obviously the trans issue as well, but they have been galloping to the right, unfortunately, on the question of migrants, refugees, and so on, kind of aping, almost competing really with the Tory party about how hard they're going to be on migrants coming across the channel and so on. I mean, it's really, it's pretty awful. I mean, ever since Corbyn was pushed out, Jeremy Corbyn was pushed out after 2019 election, they've just galloped to the right at a real pace of knots. So I mean, it's an interesting election. I mean, the Conservatives are, for very good reasons, because we've had now what 14 years of austerity, in which social services, the National Health Service, has been, really savaged. Local government services and so on, massive, job losses in the public sector, and huge cuts. And of course, in terms of pay and salaries, those, I'm sure it's the same in North America as well. In fact, I know it is. Have been reduced really at historical levels. I saw somewhere the other day, as part of the kind of election background, somebody had done some, one of the units had done a calculation on what the average salary, average wages would be had the rate of increase around about 2008 continued, and we hadn't had the financial crash and so on. And it would be something like £10,000 a year. I don't know what that is in dollars. What's that, about $16,000, something like
Probably
that? More than it currently is. So people have suffered, real terms cuts, not just in the sort of the social wage, if you like, but in terms of the real wages. And we saw a whole series of strikes, public sector in particular strikes, national strikes, which didn't really break through, I think, from what a lot of us were hoping last year. They were, there was some unpleasant, unhelpful, unremarkable deals done by the trade union leaderships, who grabbed almost the first offers, and sellout is not too strong a word, I think. There are still strikes going on, but not, and there's a doctors' strike. Junior doctors are on strike this week in the run up to the election. And good for them, they've resisted the pressure to call it off because of the general election, which is next Thursday. So that's good. I mean, in terms of it's an interesting election, as I say, because the Tories are something like 20 points, roughly 20 points behind the Labour Party. So they are, unless something absolutely unexpected happens in the next week, they are going to get a drubbing. They're talking about, pundits are talking about they may well have the worst election outcome since 1832, which was bad.
But that being said, when it comes to the Labour Party, which I've always felt was always a rival oligarchic party, a rival imperialist party, a rival Zionist party, a rival pro-nuclear weapons party, is there anything within the Labour manifesto which you think that the working class, the broad, precarious middle class, are going? Anything about the Labour Party's manifesto which you go, okay, this isn't great, but it's not totally anti-left. It's not totally vanquishing the Corbyn legacy, which people are going to, in which you think the vast working class people are going to just hold their nose, vote for Labour, but vote for Labour more as a protest vote just to get the the Tories out. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, there isn't really anything. There is nothing left of the Corbyn project, or even of the promises that the current Labour Party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, made when he fought for the leadership position. He made a whole number of promises, and they've all gone. They've all been ditched. I mean, there's vague stuff in there about the environment, but they've rolled back on their commitments to put in, a lot of money in response to kind of climate change and so on. So you could see it's less bad, I suppose, than
that's interesting you say
the
that.
Tories,
Well, that's go ahead.
I mean, on sort of social issues, and particularly things around the question of migrants and LGBT rights and women's rights and so on. It's actually it's not as good as even the Liberal Democrats, who, I mean, the Liberal Democrats may well win some more seats, but they won't. The Liberal Democrats are the only, and the Greens actually to some extent, are the only political parties, the minority parties really, who have got reasonable positions on things like climate and trans rights and not so much on the question of racism and migrants. I'm afraid all of them are pretty much committed to stop the boats. How would we do it? Some would do it kind of less obviously than others, and unfortunately some on the left or allegedly on the left have capitulated on these positions as well, notably George Galloway's party, the Workers' Party of Britain, which describes itself as for the workers, not the wokers, which kind of tells you. I know, yes, it's awful. It tells you where they go. I mean, I don't think you can even regard George Galloway as being on the left anymore. It's pretty dreadful. But I suppose what I'm saying is that many people will vote Labour on the grounds that they're not enthusiastic about it. I mean, it's very notable that there haven't been any kind of large rallies, as there were for Corbyn, in 2019. There haven't been any of those big rallies, really, with a lot of enthusiasm. But you know, a lot of people who voted Tory voted for Boris Johnson over the Brexit issue back in 2019 are kind of saying, well, you know, I won't be voting for them again, and they'll vote Liberal Democrat or vote Tory, I guess. There is, I mean,
or
the
even
whole thing
possibly
is
vote
being
reform.
skewed. Well, the whole thing's being skewed partly by the intervention of Nigel Farage, in the who at a very late stage actually decided he would stand in Clacton for the Reform Party that he's now taken control of again, which used to be the UKIP, etc., etc. You know, it's another iteration of the same party, really.
Yeah.
They're putting up a large number of candidates, and they are actually, some of the polls are suggesting that in fact, one of the polls last week suggested they had overtaken the Tory party they were on 18% or whatever it was, 19%. The Tories were on about 18. I mean, that doesn't translate into, because of the odd British electoral first past the post system, it doesn't translate into similar numbers of seats, of course, and they might only win a tiny number of seats. But it's bad news because their intervention, particularly around the question of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers and so on, that which is openly racist. I mean, it's as bad as Enoch Powell, you know, in 1960.
Oh yeah. I mean,
and they're pulling the whole
net zero immigration is
exactly,
what
yes,
Nigel
right.
Farage and the Reform Party has pledged, and that's not just towards illegal immigration. That's even for legal immigration.
Yeah. No, like, that's right.
Absolute madness. But yeah,
no, it's awful. It's dreadful stuff. But the impact of reform is actually pulling the Tory party further to the right, and that's pulling Labour further to the right. And there is no, I mean, there is no kind of, you know, workers' party that socialists or people who have a class consciousness as working class can kind of get behind, apart from some independents and a very small number of kind of socialist candidates standing. It's tiny, really. One of the tragedies is that Jeremy Corbyn, who is standing, they refused to let him stand for the Labour Party because he's suspended. That he is standing as an independent in his constituency in Islington.
North,
he may win, he may not, who knows? But you know, major opportunity missed, really, I'm afraid, because he could have, if he'd actually have announced, say, at one of the very large Palestine demonstrations that have been taking place, because I mean, you know, the UK and London, in one sense, are the kind of protest capitals of over Gaza, you know, around the world. If he'd have announced, you know, that, well, I'm breaking with Labour, you know, I will, with others, form, you know, a party, you know, some sort of electoral formation, it might have been in a very different situation. But he's so wedded to the Labour Party and Labour politics and the kind of, you know, the idea that you win socialism and reforms through Parliament, etc., that he hasn't done that. Terrible mistake, it really. But that's the nature of where a lot of the left is in the UK, I'm afraid. Well, and around the world, of course. You know.
Yes. And I'm glad that you brought that up, and I think I mean, yeah, no, it is a very strange election, and I have heard from and it's interesting that you mentioned the Liberal Democrats, because I actually find that the Liberal Democrats, if you compare what they want to do with the National Health Service compared to what Labor wants to do, as you've said, Labor keeps giving very vague promises. We might raise taxes on the wealthy over here to pay for this. We are going to raise taxes on private schools in order to fund mental health care and even dental health care, although the mental health care is still just subsidizing private mental health facilities. What needs to happen is mental health care needs to be merged within an NHS, and the NHS needs to be renationalized. It needs to be a proper NHS, not this quasi for-profit system that it has become since, well, some would say since the dawn of Thatcherism, others would more accurately say New Labour, but certainly since the Tory Liberal Democrats coalition, the NHS has effectively been privatized. But that being said, if you looking at what the Liberal Democrats are promising compared to what Labour is promising, I mean, if that's people's number one issue or number two or number three, I would vote for the Liberal Democrats, even though the Liberal Democrats have pivoted to the right on a lot of other topics like foreign policy and also engaging in a little bit of anti-migrants and dog whistles and so forth. And we've heard from other people, lifelong socialist activists that have always tried to make a Labour the party that advances social justice. I've heard from a lot of them on record on their own YouTube programs saying, you know, I'm considering voting for the Greens. And then you have others who are saying, well, I'm going to vote for Labour because I think Labour has a good chance of winning in my constituency. But if I was in such and such a riding, I would be voting for George Galloway. If I was in such and such a riding, Chris Williamson. If I was in such a riding and there was this independent person or this lefty person or this green person, oh, I would definitely be voting for them. So I'm curious if a lot. Well, actually, yes, I'm curious because you work a lot with the Socialist Workers Party. Are a lot of SWP members or even people who go to the Marxism festivals and the occasional meetings, are a lot of them going to be voting like that out of curiosity?
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting because, of course, the Marxism event starts next week, actually, a week. Well, it actually starts on the Thursday of the election. So it's going to be the Friday we will know. And I'm sure lots of people will be discussing how they voted. I have already voted because I have postal votes. So we did vote Labour, and the reason we voted Labour
Laura, why?
In our constituency here, we have an awful Tory. It's a marginal constituency, and we have an awful Tory. Who's also awfully transphobic. I mean, she's way on the right of the party. And so for us, it was a kind of a tactical thing. You know, our votes would count towards, getting rid of her, hopefully. But in a lot of other places, I mean, for the first, I think probably, I'm trying to think back, but I think it's the first election where the SWP hasn't explicitly called for, vote Labour with no illusions. We have not come up with that slogan and haven't used it. What we've said is, vote left, vote. There are independents, who are standing also obviously against Labour, who we're saying, yes, vote for them. We are supporting Jeremy Corbyn in his constituency, and we're going out actually campaigning with Jeremy Corbyn as well. We're kind of, I think, past the stage where you can say vote Labour with no illusions.
Yes.
I mean, it's interesting about the Lib Dems because although, as I said earlier, the Lib Dems, most of them, as far as I'm aware, have a much better position. They're more openly supportive, for example, around trans rights than most Labour people are. Labour people are keeping their heads down on this issue, and some of them, unfortunately, are also transphobic, as we know. I mean, Wes Streeting, for example, who's the shadow health secretary, will probably be the health secretary from next Friday, has said he will no longer call trans women, for instance, which he was prepared to describe trans women as women, years ago. Now he's saying he's fallen prey to this kind of drive to, the J.K. Rowling position of hostility, really, to trans rights. Lib Dems, I mean, I personally wouldn't vote Lib Dem because I remember what they did when they were in coalition with the Conservative Party from 2010 to 2015, because they first of all reneged on the promise to get rid of student loans, and when they actually increased it massively, and of course they were part of a government for 5 years up until 2015 that pushed through massive cuts, massive austerity, and they are like the Greens actually, when they're actually, in local government, as some of them are, they don't hesitate to, to push through the cuts that come from central government and implement them locally, sort of cutting back on local services, garbage collections, all that kind of stuff. They will do it and have done it, So, I mean, some of the Greens definitely sound better. And I know a lot of people on the left are considering, a lot of the people who supported Corbyn, for instance, in the Labour Party, can't bring themselves to vote Labour after what they've done. And because, I mean, literally thousands of people have been driven out of the Labour Party. Sometimes,
and many have expressed voting Greens. Politics Joe, which is this left leaning, it's a left leaning outlet in Britain, very popular YouTube channel. I imagine as popular as Navarre Media and so forth. The one of the correspondence there is quite well. Actually, they're all more or less very supportive of transgender rights, which is fantastic. I'll even link to two programs they did with a transgender woman and with a Canadian left-leaning drag queen, and they went to some music festival where they talked with a lot of the young people there about who they're going to vote for. And a lot of them said that they're going to vote for Labour just to get the Tories out. Others said that they're considering voting for Liberal Democrats. Others said, I'm ex-Labour. I was very supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, but I really don't like Keir Starmer. I'm probably not going to vote, but gun to my head and vote, I'll probably vote for the Greens. They're the closest to, my values and so forth. And many people said a version of that, which I find quite interesting. And I know a friend of mine is I believe she's probably going to vote for the Greens. Well, she's considering, okay, do I either vote for the Greens and help that party, or do I vote for Andrew Feinstein against Keir Starmer? So,
yeah. I mean, again, the irony is, of course, that the Greens currently only have one MP out of 650 odd.
Caroline Lucas, who is great on her, she's great when it comes to a Green New Deal, but when it comes to militarism, I'm surprised that somebody who's who's an eco-socialist is supportive of NATO and is supportive of the pivot to Asia. When Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters, many of them who were Greens, who simply wanted to try to advance a socialist agenda within Labour, she, slandered a lot of people as anti-Semites and stuff like that. And I've never been able to forgive her for that. But as opposed to punishing the Greens as a whole, I'm still, I still wouldn't say completely, disavow the Greens in that respect. But that being said, the Green parties, certainly in Germany, that's a right-wing party. That's a green capitalist party. In Canada, they are very much a green capitalist party. In the U.S., well, I think Dr. Jill Stein is going to win the nomination again, and they're very much a proper eco-socialist party at home and anti-imperialist party abroad. But
no, it varies, doesn't it? The closer they get to power, wherever it is, the less radical they are on these social questions, really.
So very difficult choices. But when it comes to the issue of the LGBTQIA plus community, I mean, if I would not know who to vote for. I mean, as you say, probably Liberal Democrats, and for me, because the Liberal Democrats are very great on the NHS and social care, that would be my constructive protest vote against, Labour and the Tories, or vote for Green. Or you mentioned West Starling, right?
West Streeting.
Yeah, West Streeting. So that's still for the North, right?
I'm not sure which constituency. Yes, it is. I can't remember what his constituency is.
There's a great Anglo-Palestinian woman who's running against her. That's one of those independents, Leanne Mohammed. And so, folks, if you're watching, please vote for her. And
Yeah,
if we're not going to vote for her,
no,
at least vote for like Greens or like Greens or like
no, I would vote
definitely
as
vote
far,
against Labour and the Conservatives.
yeah, vote as far left as possible. But it is messy, and a lot of there are a lot of people who sort of thinking, I think, about voting for Galloway's party, for instance. And it's when I say a lot, I don't. They might win. Galloway might win a seat. I doubt that if anybody else will. But it's debatable, whether they are. I mean, they seem to be prepared to kind of split the left on social questions, even though they talk about, they're very good on the question of Gaza and what's happening to the Palestinians. That's really where George Galloway's been for the last 30 odd years, I guess. 25,
yeah, and
in
in terms of being anti-NATO and wanting détente with Russia, in terms of being anti-pivot to Asia and wanting détente with China, they are very good on that. But that being said, when it comes to, I mean, yeah, no, I mean, yeah, let's not be around the bush. We have to talk about it. When it comes to the issue of trans rights, and I would even say the entire queer community, maybe the rest of the party is not right wing on this issue, but George Galloway has pivoted to the right on that issue. And I always thought Galloway, who ever since he was wrongly kicked out of the Labour Party and founded his party Respect, and then since then has kind of gone sort of independent. I always thought Galloway was very great when it came to the issue of migrants and the rights of immigrants, legal or otherwise, because the constituencies he's always represented, and a large part are people from broad, South Asian communities, Middle Eastern communities, Muslim majority countries, and so forth like that, and the Palestinian diaspora. So I'm quite shocked that when he was supportive of Brexit as a Lexiteer, I mean, there was a couple of vague stuff he said about migrants, which probably should have been, red flags. But it was mostly, that he wanted, renationalizing. Well, anyways, he was very much, a lefty when it came to the issue of Brexit. Although I think he became way too much of a Brexit fundamentalist in the end of the day, which did, cause Corbyn to not become a prime minister, because so many of those supposedly Lexiteers, wanted, Brexit, and so they voted for, Boris Johnson, or they voted for the Brexit party. But funny enough, a lot of those supposed leftists, one of them is Paul Emberby. If you look at where they are now on other topics of the day, very regressive, very much like wanting control like immigration, very much transphobic and so forth like that. So yeah. I think the lesson learned for everybody is that, if you smell an if of right-wing ism, don't be supportive of such and such an organization, of such and such a figure, because and that's my 2 cents on. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
I mean, George Galloway has always been anti-abortion.
Which I'm surprised by that as well.
Yeah, no, well, I was, because initially now
no more surprises.
I knew about his position when we formed Respect with him, because obviously it wasn't just George Galloway, it was the SWP and some others as well. And I think the truth of it is he kept that one fairly quiet, because it was not something that was Respect's position at all. Obviously, Respect was very pro-abortion and so on. But it was one of the kind of compromises that I guess he made at the time, that he wouldn't speak out on issues like that. Anyway, and we were able to, I think, the kind of left, if you like, and the SWP was the bulk of that left in Respect, was able to kind of discipline him a bit, I suppose, so that he didn't shoot his mouth off on issues like that. But he has shifted, as you say, he's lurched into a kind of awful kind of populism around. I guess he would regard it as kind of left populism, but actually, it
That's
just
not the
apes
left
the right.
populism I support.
No,
Definitely
no. So
not. No.
it apes the right. I mean, he's talking about not wanting so-called inappropriate sex and relationship education in schools. The family is sacrosanct for him. Therefore, he sort of won't say cruel things about LGBT plus people. He says, but at the same time, he doesn't regard them as kind of legitimate.
Oh yes, and
It's sad.
yeah, and he said on the Vara media that he does not want his children. Actually, that's a very good segue to. Actually, that's a very good segue. Thank you for that. Yes, he says that he doesn't want his children being taught that same-sex relationships are normals, because in his words, they're not normal. I will defend their right, but if they were normal, well, we wouldn't be we wouldn't have a species anymore. That's me paraphrasing literally what he said, and I find it, I just find it very dismaying because when you were on this program, I said I said on this program, and I'll say this again: even if you don't get transgender, even if you don't get non-binaryism and intersex, or the entire LGBTQIS plus, even if you don't get it, it's okay. If you don't get it, as long as you just aren't an asshole. and that's all I ever ask of any leftist that does harbor heteronormative views, is just don't engage in being an asshole. And but here we are.
I mean, yes.
And I'm curious, and actually, let's talk about education before we comment on the broader left and how they have been towards the trans community and toward the broader LGBTQIS plus community. So George Galloway has said he's been attacking the SNP. A lot of times he attacks the SNP from the right. He believes that the SNP are too woke. In fact, many people say this about the SNP, that the SNP is too focused on trans liberation, that they're too focused on identity politics, not enough on the issue of class and fighting against austerity, which I don't believe. I just don't believe that many people who are hostile towards the SNP aren't supportive of Scottish independence to begin with. But George Galloway has said that the SNP, and he has said that in general, many liberal classes in England are teaching people 72 genders and stuff like that. So your response to that, seeing as I know you're a retired education union member, but I know for a fact that you do know many people who are part of making educate. Anyways, what's your response to that? And folks who do work in education, I'm curious, your response to that, since I'm sure you're in touch with them about what's really happening and not what, George Galloway and what the Sun and other, right-wing douchebags are saying.
Yeah. I mean, well, the SNP's position actually was actually quite good. And of course they got blocked, didn't they? It's the beginning of last year, wasn't it? Was it this year? Time flies, I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
By the Westminster government, when they tried to push through the amendment or vote, they voted in favour, large majority actually, in favour of amending the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland to introduce self-ID. So the SNP were kind of, keen on that. It was the split, the Alex Salmond split from the SNP. The ALBA, it's called, is their party, isn't it? They only have, I think, one or two MPs who split from the SNP themselves, who are really transphobic and kind of very much in kind of political bed with some of the transphobic organisations in Scotland, like Sex Matters and so on. But yeah, back to where we are. I mean, what we've been left with in education, in particular, is some proposals from the Tories, which were published some while ago. Actually, they published some draft guidelines for schools, not so much colleges or universities, but for schools, which were very much about making it difficult for young trans students to socially transition. So there was advice about not keeping this confidential, informing parents, about pronoun use and so on, about use of facilities, sports playing, and all that kind of stuff in the school in a school environment. That's kind of parked now because of the election. And they put it out for consultation, but in reality, they're going to try and push it through anyway if they hadn't had the election that soon. In addition, they have also published some guidelines about hospitals and trans people in hospitals, where they were going to try and force, not that actually many hospitals these days have mixed wards, but they were going to try and force trans people into wards which were
doesn't align with their gender,
with their ascribed agenda at birth, even if you had a gender recognition certificate, actually. So not good at all. But that's kind of in part. And of course, they also, just before, a few weeks before the election was announced, actually, they dropped, the Health Secretary Victoria Atkins banned puberty blockers from being this is a 3-month ban on the prescription of any new prescription of puberty blockers for young trans and non-binary people, and that of course is a red hot potato that as it is likely to be when the Labour government comes in, they're going to have to make a decision about what they do around that come before September. And this was in the wake of the Cass review, which we haven't kind of talked about yet, but it was in the wake of the publication of that, which was mid-April.
And the Cass review, safe to say, very transphobic, right?
Well, they would obviously say they're not. They would say they've got lots of recommendations in there, which are about better facilities, better training, more resources for trans people. Particularly trans youth, because it was a review of the gender services, really, gender identity services for young people. Although part of the criticism of her review, it's called the Cass review because it was carried out by a retired paediatrician, Hilary Cass. But part of the criticism of her is that she also has some kind of comments in that review which actually talk about things like, well, the human brain doesn't really mature until the age of 25. This is a bit of a myth, actually, but there you go. And therefore, actually, there ought to be the same review of adult gender services, not just, services up to the age of 18, which is what her remit was. And so, there are kind of nondescript recommendations, which I don't think you would argue with. Better resources, better training, and all this. But the real stuff is what she says, if you like, about accessing puberty blockers and cross-sex endocrinology, and what she doesn't say about what a terrible state the gender identity services in the UK are. That they closed the only young person's gender clinic, which was at the Tavistock. There's an offshoot at an outreach here in Leeds, actually, at St James's Hospital. But they closed that on the grounds that they would then open regional centres, and people wouldn't have to travel all the way to London, or so young people wouldn't have to travel all the way to London. But only one of those centres has opened so far, which means that there's huge waiting lists. I mean, the average time now for a young person to get a first appointment. First appointment is about 6 years. Now, I mean, if you're 10 or 11 or 12, you're going to be going through puberty or gone through puberty by the time you get seen. And there's all sorts of myths kind of built into the report about the numbers of people who detransition, somehow seeing this as significant numbers of trans people when it isn't. It's about 1%. And also, and what they regarded as acceptable research evidence. They were talking about whether peer-reviewed studies had been, whether the methodology used for those peer-reviewed studies was double-blind, where neither the experimenter nor the subject actually knows what they're getting, which of course it isn't a model applied in a lot of medical formats, because it's unethical. You can't withhold medicine to sick people like that. If you're talking about puberty blockers, you can't simply not give one group puberty blockers, because it becomes very obvious that they haven't been getting them within a short space of time. So there was all sorts of problems, excuse me, about the nature of that report, really.
And yes, and then the S&P, then of course, they wanted to just amend the Gender Recognition Act, which which calls for equality between genders, and simply wanted to amend it so that trans people were also recognized. And now I believe, although there was a lot of opposition to it in Scotland, but a majority of the Scottish Parliament, so that's SNP, that's the Scottish Greens that also advocate independence, the Scottish Tories, Scottish Labour, Scottish Lib Dems, actually were more or less in favor of this very, very quiet amendment, but Westminster blocked that, right?
Okay. Yes, that's right.
And then since
I'm just saying they used something called the Scotland Act, which allows them to override legislation under certain circumstances from the devolved parliaments. So the devolved parliaments in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland.
Yes, and then since then, there's been a scandal within the SNP. Nicola Sturgeon, her husband, are being investigated over whether they misused money, blah 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 blah, and all that sort of stuff. And there's been a lot, and basically ever since then, there's been a lot of attacks from the SNP, but people attacking the SNP from the right. And so you mentioned Alex Salmond and his new party, Alba. Yes, I've been very dismayed that they have been playing that they're basically transphobic. They're not playing footsie with transphobia. They are very much transphobic. And the new leader of the SNP, there was a person from a Pakistani Muslim background who took over Nicola Sturgeon's position, and the person that came second place was this Katie Degula or something like that, who also a member of the SNP, but was very much like a proud Christian woman and was very transphobic. The new leader of the SNP, after Yusuf Hamza faced a vote of no confidence, is John Sweeney, who's been a longtime SNP member, worked with Alex Salmond, worked with Nicola Sturgeon, and he said when he won the leadership, that Katie Degula, I'm sorry if I'm butchering her name and not pronouncing it right, but basically said that this transphobic SNP member would play a big role in his administration. So we even see that the SNP are going to start to throw trans people under the bus, which I think is very tragic. And then again, you talked about George Galloway. He tried to set up like an all united front against the SNP and against Scottish independence didn't go anywhere, but it doesn't matter because now you do have a lot of people who either didn't care about trans issues or were vaguely supportive of it, all pivoting to the right on this issue.
Yeah.
But when we talk about education, what is really happening though with education in England when it comes to when it comes to trans liberation and being much more uh, queer friendly? So you often get these right wing dingbats and supposed leftists like George Galloway saying that children are being taught sex ed at a way too young of an age, and that they're being taught that it's okay to choose between 72 genders and all sorts of transphobic anti-trans tropes like that. But what is really going on what is really going on though in the mainstream education system?
Well, I mean, there is sex and relationship education, but it's all age appropriate.
Exactly.
What's taught to 14 and 15-year-olds is not what's taught to 7 and 8-year-olds. That's the truth of it, but it becomes a kind of it becomes a bit of a moral panic. I mean, there was about 3 years ago now, there was some issues in Birmingham where parents were kind of objecting to their kids, being in these classes, being subject to these, and that was pretty nasty, kind of homophobic stuff, actually. Coming from kind of, I guess, kind of, pretty right-wing Muslim, mainly right-wing Muslim parents and parent groups. And that's, again, that was based on misunderstandings of what is actually being taught to kids. Because I mean, it's certainly the case that a lot of kids have same-sex parents, for goodness sake, and want to feel that they are recognized, in the education, and that having same-sex parents is nothing to be worried about, concerned about, ashamed of, or anything like that. And so the education is very much about saying there are all sorts of different family structures, there are all sorts of ways of living, and so on. And it isn't, of course, teaching that there are 99 genders or 72 genders, or whatever it is. It is also saying, that some people, don't fall into simple categories of male or female. Some people can transition, da 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 da. And that's about it, really. I mean, it doesn't teach them to do it. It teaches them, if you like, to be tolerant, I suppose, of different forms of living. And I mean, the big worry the reality is, there is going to be a Labour government, next Friday there will be a Labour government, and for a lot of people, a lot of trans people, they don't have great hopes. The hope is that a Labour government, Keir Starmer, will chuck out all this, the nonsense, but it's difficult to have a lot of optimism about that. He was questioned on a debate yesterday, I think it was, about this question which Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, has claimed is his weak spot. He can't define what a woman is, and instead of saying what we on the trans supportive left would say, that a trans woman is a woman, trans man is a man, and no equivocation about this at all. That he's tried to ride two horses, by saying, on the one hand, we want to support trans people's lives. We don't want to encourage hatred and so on, transphobia. On the other hand, we want to protect private spaces for single-sex private spaces for biological women. Now I mean, what does he actually mean by that? For biological
Exactly.
women and for transgender women or not? And that's the crunch, of course. And he's kind of sat on the fence about it. And the worry is that, are they going to go along with the kind of transphobic stuff? Are they going to go? What are they going to do about, for example, the attempts to change the Equality Act, which gives protections for trans people? You don't even have to have actually a gender recognition certificate to be protected, to have protections against discrimination and so on under the gender recognition, under the Equality Act. What are they going to do about attempts to change that? What are they going to do about the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which has become, unfortunately, a voice for transphobic aims in recent years, instead of doing what it should do, which is defend and protect all protected and vulnerable categories of people? They've actually, gone down the road of becoming more, because the Tories have have parachuted in transphobic commissioners, into the EHRC, and that's supposed to be the key body that protects all those vulnerable groups, vulnerable oppressed groups, and so on. So I'm kind of going on about this because it's not clear, what Labour will do. Will they capitulate further to the right, or will they actually, draw a line in the sand and say, actually, that trans people have protection, trans women have every right to be in single-sex spaces, as of course do trans men, and stick to that. And it's a worry. There's a case at the moment. I've just seen it before talking to you, Youri, of a group of nurses at a hospital in the northeast of England who are taking a legal action against against their hospital, allowing a trans woman to use the nurse's changing room. This is a nurse to change, at the beginning and end of their shift. And a group of women, and J.K. Rowling has got involved in this and said she'd be very happy to meet these women, to egg them along, obviously. That's a court case which will be land in the lap of the Labour Party, potentially.
And this one, and is this nurse, this female nurse, is she already fully transitioned on top of that?
It's not clear from the reports whether that's the case or not.
Okay.
But certainly she's certainly socially transitioned, but it's not clear whether whether that includes other aspects of transition as well.
But then,
so it's a very interesting time here. I mean, one of the things that's missing as well.
Well, very, very dark times and very darkly farcical times. But then I know you have to go soon, so I have two questions then.
Okay.
Then two questions. Number one then is okay. Well, this question is okay. So you say that that in a lot of mainstream schools in Britain, and I assume it's the same in Scotland and Wales to various degrees. I'm not even going to count Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland is a whole other can of worms. But one of these days, need to do a show all about Northern Ireland and what's going on in Northern Ireland when it comes to these hot topics. But basically, it sounds to me as if the schools that people go to, when they are taught about, when they are taught, as you say, they are taught at appropriate ages when they're teenagers about sex education. And when they are taught about man, woman, they're simply taught, and I'm pretty sure it's probably 2 sentences maximum that it's spent on. Some people will identify as women and will go on later in life to changing their gender, and same with it when it comes to man. And basically, if people are taught about same-sex relationships and transgenders and even the whole concept of non-binaryism, they're taught that, but they're taught very briefly that, and it's mostly to teach kids to be much more tolerant and much more open-minded. But that's about it. It's not at all a huge, like there aren't like entire courses taught to teenagers about transgender people, about non-binary people, about even same-sex people, correct?
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. It's a brief exposure to the realities of sex and gender. And I mean, obviously that includes, I mean, it's in the context of relationships as well, very much, in terms of what's appropriate behavior in a relationship, any kind of, violence against women is completely unacceptable, controlling behavior, how to avoid it, how to give confidence to young women who may be already in relationships about, what's appropriate, in terms of how they're treated, I guess. So it's within that broad kind of context, really.
Then, and it's just so sad to see so many. It's so sad to see uh, so many leftists, particularly in Britain, engage in well, basically grotesque heteronormative behavior by, first of all, recycling nonsense junk journalism that comes from right-wing newspapers, which they're supposed to be, anti against because they're anti-worker, they're anti, everybody. And then to see them, not only play footsie, but all in all, advance, a heteronormative agenda, when in the end of the day, the queer community, a lot of them, would complain that actually people aren't taught enough how to be tolerant towards towards gay people, lesbian people, bisexual people, and so forth. And these classes, yeah, they just teach people very briefly be tolerant towards the trans community, but they don't even teach people about intersex people and so forth like that. So that being said, uh, when we talk about the future of fighting against heteronormativity, heteronormative views and defending the trans community and other people within the queer community, if a Labour government is going to continue on with the transphobia of the Tory party, and we're going to see a lot of leftists, straight leftists, throw trans people in the queer community under the bus, do you think then that we're going to see a lot of people in the queer community basically ask their parents who are tolerant, and their parents who protect them, mom and dad or dad and mom, can you please take me out of school and just homeschool me, and whatever you guys want to teach me about same-sex relationships, transgender, non-binary, and intersex, just get me to into an LGBTQIA plus supportive group, and whatever questions I'm going to ask them, I'm going to ask them.
Well, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it, predicting the future? I can't imagine.
I know a friend of mine who says that, like, if she has kids, she just wants to homeschool them, and
yeah,
and if they come out as like trans or anything, she believes that they're going to be in a much better environment being homeschooled and just talking with somebody of of a queer background than what they're going to get in a mainstream school, especially if
No, I can understand the sentiment. I mean, as somebody who's spent my life in state education, pretty much, I would always argue that we should be attempting to make the state education system and the national curriculum, because of course sex and relationship education is part of the national curriculum as it stands, defending that, and a lot is going to come down to what the schools decide to implement, or kind of how to implement any changes if they do come about via a Labour government. I mean, I'm hoping it just sinks below the waves and is never seen again. These recommendations or proposals that the Tories had. The other thing, of course, is what the unions do, what the teaching unions do, because obviously a lot of the onus, the day-to-day onus, will fall on individual teachers and then subsequently on their managers and on their, their union reps and so on. Because if a teacher says, well, I will not betray a confidence, I will not implement anything that I think is, transphobic or homophobic or whatever, and then runs foul of a disciplinary process, then obviously the unions are going to be crucial. And having the good thing, the encouraging thing is that once again, the teaching unions, whether that's my union, the University and College Union, which looks at essentially post-16 education largely, or the NEU, the National Education Union, which looks at primary, secondary education, they have reiterated strong policies of support for LGBT plus rights, for trans rights as well, and opposition to what the Tories have been trying to do. And also, I mean, my union also has passed motion of opposition to what, the Cass review. And so, that's what we need, really. What we need is a lot more open campaigning. The last thing we need in the face of all this is people despairing, and going back in the closet, or I don't know, just trying to pull their kids out of the education system,
or even suppressing their own
exactly
sexuality, or their own true gender identity, and just keeping in the closets, and then coming out late in life after they've already had, like, whatever, a family and children and so forth. That's why I think it's much better to be teaching kids at an early age about transgender, and that it's okay, rather than, people suppressing all of this and then, coming out late in life that they are trans, or that they are whatever in the queer spectrum.
No, yes, absolutely, yeah. And actually, the good thing is, that support for, trans rights and trans lives is much stronger. I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, but it's here in the UK. Surveys suggest that amongst young people, it's kind of, school age kids, it's kind of taken for granted by a lot of kids these days. It wasn't 20 years ago, 30 years ago, of course. Now it is. There's a real generational difference in levels of support for trans rights in general, than compared to older, younger as opposed to older. And you see a lot of it, actually. I mean, it was interesting. We had a protest in Leeds a couple of weeks after the Cass review came out, organised by Trans Leeds. And that was quite short notice, but quite sizable. A couple of hundred people, I suppose, were there. And what was interesting was that a number of the speakers at that event were actually students who were also involved in the encampment up at the university in support of
Palestine.
Exactly. And it's that same kind of constituency of young people who see the connections. They see the connections between supporting migrant rights, supporting, Gaza, and campaigning against the genocide, and also supporting LGBT plus rights. They see those connections, they make those connections, and they are the people who are the future, aren't they? They're the people who are going to be the campaigners, the fighters, hopefully the socialists, hopefully the revolutionary socialists of the future. And they are radicalized, and we have there is a massive worldwide movement that is radicalizing in an anti-imperialist direction, which is very encouraging. And part of that is worldwide support for minority rights as well.
And there's been we have to unfortunately we have to wrap the show. We're going a bit over time. So unfortunately we have to wrap up the show. But before I say some closing things, so the hope, so it's not all doom and gloom, because organizations, however big or small, like the SWP, like the unions. So a lot of the unions, that's the education unions, the teachers unions, and the trade unions in Britain, are actually quite supportive of queer liberation, transgender rights. So I shouldn't be in despair, and others who are actually based in Britain shouldn't be in despair when they see George Galloway recycle a lot of heteronormative views and just junk journalism when he says such and such a school is teaching this. So we actually shouldn't be in despair, because in general, a lot of the broad left and a lot of the popular left organizations and militant union organizations actually are on the side of queer liberation and not heteronormative capitalism, and certainly not rainbow capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Okay, that's fantastic. And okay, well, we're gonna have to get you back on then in the future, Laura, to talk about maybe do an election autopsy. But in the future, I also would like to talk to you about education, why the right wing is so determined to make education this competitive, bullying streak. But I hope, but let's hope that whomever gets into power, whether it's Labor, whether it's a maybe even a coalition government between Labor and Lib Dems, or if the Tories manage to once again stay in power. I don't know how they do it. Here's hoping that that the queer liberation movement and their allies, and I say this to people in the straight community and who are gender conforming. Let's hope that that they simply fight back against the reign of terror that any of these parties are going to unleash, whether it comes to heteronormativity or continuing on with being classist, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And anything you want to say before we close the program?
I don't think so. No, thank you. It's been good to talk to you. We've covered an awful lot. So
alrighty, and also we have to say solidarity to all of those who are fighting for a free Palestine, which a lot of them have also been queer groups, haven't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And also, just want to, before closing, how can straight people be good allies to the LGBTQIA plus community? I have here, this is my T-shirt of Kurt Cobain, and I want to actually say Kurt Cobain actually was very much ahead of his time, because he actually was for queer liberation, and in school he actually hated the jocks and hated machismo music that was coming out of mainstream rock and roll. His best friends are actually people in the gay, lesbian, bisexual community, and so a lot of the jocks would beat the shit out of him because they thought he was gay, and he actually thought that it was because he was very antisocial and hated most of the people in his school. He actually would say, yeah, I'm gay, yeah, I'm bisexual, and would take the punches for a lot of his friends in that respect. And in a fantastic interview on The Advocate, which is one of the largest LGBTQIA plus magazines, Cobain gave a very interesting interview where he talks about his defense of the queer community, and even said I even wondered sometimes if I was bisexual, but now that I'm married with Courtney, who knows? I probably would have led a bisexual, life had it not been for finding the one. So yeah. I think straight leftists, I think we can take inspiration from Kurt Cobain, and I think that's kind of how we have to escalate our defense of the LGBTQIA plus community, which is fuck with people's heads about and say, actually, I am trans, or actually, I am bisexual, and see how tolerant people are like that. But in general, I just think that in general, I just think that those on the straight left, we need to make our voices more louder and clear that we don't support heteronormativity in any way, shape, or form. And here's hoping we don't get into a situation where queer families and families who the parents are straight but have a queer child, an intersex child, and so forth, don't feel that they have to take their kids out of school, homeschool them, just so that they're in a safe environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Laura, we were joining this edition of 1+1 with Laura Miles, who is a retired, longtime union education activist, and she is also the author of Transgender Resistance, Socialism, and the Fight for Trans Liberation, which is a book I can't recommend enough. And remember, guys, Pride started off as a riot, so educate yourself on the Stonewall riots. Many of the people who fought against the police were trans people of all, of all colors, and yes, and power to the people, death to heteronormativity, power to the people, death to capitalism, and and solidarity forever to the Palestinian community. So thank you so much, Laura, and
you're welcome.
Hope to have you back on in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Good to talk to you.